Okay. Good morning. I'd like to focus, to take as an obstacle the rational and the free will. I thought this very impressive how you put it, Elia, so that the free will consists of intelligence, so in pushing the rational. And this at the same time, the rational or rationalization always needs to identify an origin. So there is a dynamics with of the rational connected to what we call a free will, which means to alienate, to, as you say, cut the umbilical cord, an origin which lies within as individuals. So it's this idea of an alienation that I want to think about in relation to an impersonal voice, perhaps has a lot with an idea of a cosmic self, or cosmic self. And when we see the self, a voice which cannot say I. I want to start actually with Heidegger and Popper, two very enemies, and look at constellations. The main objective will be on the one hand about meridian poetics, the idea of a meridian poetics, and on the other hand, this book by Vera, the Bildverlust, images, and especially this book, I more and more, and we've done a whole year on that book, still don't really have, I think now I have a constellation that's better than the one I had before, but this book is, yeah, it's it's very, very large. So with Heidegger, and things, so what we call today something like a critical stance towards metaphors. It has, in the continental branch of philosophy, a lot to do with Heidegger, who began to introduce between the ontological and the ontic. And ontic is connected to existence. This distinction, he began to spread apart the domain of physics and for psychology and existence. So being and existence don't coincide. And so that they don't coincide, in my understanding, the key difference that divides these two schools of doing philosophy today, the continental and the analytical. So the analytical, the Anglo-American school, don't accept that these two domains, existence and being, cannot they're not coextensive. That's what they refuse. And a way of proceeding unfolds, can therefore find foundation. So this is the stance, to a certain extent, for which Popper stands. That's what very clearly until now. I realize it's not so easy. There are actually very nice sides to it. But to open, in my understanding, very much a key in Heidegger, to foreground time in philosophy. No? So, and to foreground time in philosophy, everything is history now. No? So to the idealism of one spirit, which is the cause of things. But also to keep it separate from theology, no? Which also in a way acts. So time then unfolds between the first and the last day, no? For almost every doctrine, every religious doctrine. So to keep these two at bay and yet engage in a kind of philosophy for which time plays a constitutive role, a massive role in Heidegger. Okay? And the way that he began to open this up, and this is why it is so the question of literature, I think, it's what I studied originally, and then I kind of went on that very much, and I'm coming back to it more and more. So to think of a kind of a literary reason, actually, which is not what Heidegger was about. So for him, there was a connection to Dichtung, so to poetics, gave a sort of a, was never quite clear also with Heidegger whether it should count now as literature or as philosophy. So a lot of the continental schools, therefore, or in literary ways of speaking, philosophy, and produced, we say new words, no? To work with in philosophy. But this also goes together with a differentiation into domains, into fields, into schools, which becomes quite sophisticated in the 20th century. But I want to start with this one passage where he really picks up who said something similar, like Elias was talking about. If you think of, we should think of a tree. So knowledge as a tree, and the tree has roots and seed below the ground. It has and these roots, they were for Descartes metaphysics. This trunk is something like philosophy, so mathematics or philosophy. And then it has branches, and these are the sciences. So that's the image with which Descartes. The challenge with which Heidegger now say we have been wrong, or we try to close the gap between existence and being, we try to unveil directly to visible. So rather we should ask what kind of soil roots take root in, no? What kind of soil gives their firmness. And my interest now in as well as in Handke is that trees actually grow out of the air. Yeah, not primarily from the nourishment of the root. The idea to think of the centrality of the root being stability is very much a rational idea which works with notions of origin, their Grund. No? So a reason as a foundation, yet Grund. And so certainly this plays a role. No? So there's no point really in it gives stability, but it's not what makes the tree grow. The tree grow comes from the air. Plants feed off the air. They feed through photovoltaics and so on. So this is what I would like to as image. Now let's go to in a book which I was not aware of. Interesting one, The World of Parmenides, Essays in the Pre-Socratic Enlightenment. So this is the world of natural philosophy and Aristotle. Pre-Socratic Enlightenment, these are the physicians, or I don't know how they would properly be called. It's Thales, it's Anaximander, it's Pythagoras as well. Ideas of the cosmos and the practice of a kind of a speculative vision of how we could rationalize the cosmos. And to think rationally for them primarily meant with bounds, within bounds. No? So in a limited way. In a limited way, because if it is infinite, it is not philosophy, it is religion. If one affirms, if one identifies the infinite, one gives up the space of explicit articulation. So that's not really what they were about. And there is especially one essay in this book which is connection to the timeless of knowledge. And a focus, actually I didn't, okay, that's the next one. It's a focus on it. So the way that he reads these natural philosophers, if they don't want to provide a religious account of things, is looking at variance. So the rational, the speculative, metaphysical rationality seeks invariances. And think of the invariances in its represented logical invariances, which de facto means invariance and constants become exchangeable. They're the same thing. So the constants can be symbolized, named. So we have constants for the speed of light, we have constants for all sorts of things, but they're not invariances if you think of invariances in a magnitude kind of way, in a physical way, not in a logical kind of way, but in a physical kind of way. The whole book by Popper is organized, and it's important, I think it's important, that he wrote this book at the age of 88, a couple of months before he died. And it's a book which makes no citation, it's writing plainly, so what he thinks of things. And he organizes a lot of these essays around the position of Parmenides, and Parmenides stands as a kind of a transcendental or a turning moment from these metaphysical speculations to Socratic philosophy. And this is because how Parmenides, he wrote basically, it's like, you could think of it a theory of method. What is the method when we speculate like that? And then this really means a way, a path towards what we, truth or knowledge or something like that. And this wrote a poem about method, which recaps the sun god, not writing in a voice of the philosopher, counts what the sun god told him, and the sun god told him there are two ways to reach me, to reach this insight. There are two ways. One is the way of truth, and one is the way of illusion. Because our reasoning is always embodied, there is no way how we can pursue only the path of truth without immediately producing a path of illusion that calls it like a shadow that comes along. So the question of illusion and truth, they're not logical opposites where you could try to purge one from the other. They go together. And Popper's rationalism now is the idea of what he calls a critical rationalism. And the critical rationalism is something then that comes quite close to the idea of cutting the umbilical cord. It says, yes, we rationalize, but we can never affirmatively think we verify a causality from how we rationalize. So we work with models, with abstractions. This is the standing behind this one move for which Popper's positivism became very well known, very famous, for having flipped the paradigm in epistemology from verify to falsify. So his point was, in science we should acknowledge something as true as long as it is not right. So it's this critical space in between. But my quarrel with this always has been that it's a critical space, but it kind of works accumulatively. No? So, because if you don't put into question, as long as it's not falsified, it doesn't mean it's a good starting point for another quest. But the idea as you in science in this way, then the idea of building a foundation, which was the kind of an accumulative, constructive approach in the end, which I love, I resent. So it can't be like that. So these two things, knowledge, or through the image of a tree, taking into account that it actually grows out of the air, so from the most lofty things, which is really not that which rationalism can put to foundations. It kills the breath of knowledge, so to say. So my interest is with of the air, of light that is not massive, and air in respect to this. There is, Popper himself was thinking in such a direction. There is one essay which is it's entitled "Of Clocks and Clouds," and here he thinks about this. How can this critical rationality not become a relativism? How to think of this rational, moderate, something like that, without becoming doctrinaire itself. And the image he works with, on one hand, clocks as something which is extremely rational and condensed in the logics of its workings, clouds, which is not. And then he makes an interesting, let's read this maybe. So he says, to what I make a common sense view of things, some natural phenomena such as the weather or the coming and going of clouds are hard to predict. We speak of the vagaries of the weather. On the other hand, we speak of clockwork precision if we wish to describe a highly regular and predictable phenomenon. There are lots of natural processes and natural phenomena which we may place between these two extremes, the clouds on the left and the clocks on the right. The changing seasons are somewhat unreliable clocks and may therefore be put somewhere towards the right, so not too far. I suppose we shall easily agree to put animals not too far from the clouds and plants somewhat near the clocks. Among the animals, a young puppy will have to be placed further to the left than the old dog. Motor cars find their place in our arrangement according to their reliability. A Cadillac, I suppose, is pretty far over to the right, and even more so a Rolls-Royce, which will be quite close to the best of the clocks. Perhaps furthest to the right should be placed the solar system. So you see how it works in a literary way. No? Not describing with exactness in this scientific way, but he's talking about. He applies a literary kind of reason in this. And to see this, because I never really read Popper, I just what people say about him, and I was very pleasantly surprised to see actually how he writes. So clocks and clouds. In the beginning, I said that it somehow, or the best I could say now, is so the of free will and rationalism has something to do with pushing the boundaries as or with the voice of a cosmic self. Then the self is important because it can't be the cosmos. No, that would be just to identify with a certain picture of it, or a picture of it, not an image. So it can't be the cosmos itself, but there is a kind of a consciousness at work, literary now, a literary voice or an imperfect voice. There is a kind of a consciousness at work which is not our consciousness, and it's not the consciousness of neutral objectivity. So for lack of a better word, let's call it consciousness of a cosmos as a self. No? Then if we pursue the quest of science, of truth, or of knowledge, we participate to the degree that we manage to cancel our individual biographies out of the equation. Through the impersonality, there is a participation in the cosmic self, and this gives a similar like and existence that this impersonal voice is enough. No? So your impersonal voice is not the same like mine, and yours and yours. This idea I like a lot to work with. So, because then we can relate such a voice of a cosmic self, an impersonal voice, as a kind of a relation between literary reason and we never have causality. It's about storytelling. It's about plots, motifs. It's about something. It's about picking up a large respect The LAN will be about the relation of quotation and so to identify a date between the clocks and the clouds. Literary reason and mathematical thinking. Yeah, in the sense of an so then when with the metaphysic or with the presupposition gesture, think about to rationalize as a kind of a building or a clock, something like so. How to rationalize it with Popper very far to the right. If this would be the architect, so then the architectonic involution would be or participating in this cosmic self, which develops a consciousness of its own speculation, through which it would say I. No? So the point is, the cosmos can never say I. So there's the architectonic involution, which is a kind of an interiorization of the speculation, or also a kind of I wouldn't really call it an edifice. So we have the terms for Bildung, no, Ausbildung, which are quite architectonic actually. So to arrange our heads and so on. But rather than speaking of edification or Bildung with this, I think much more of it in terms of a kind of an interior landscaping. So because the landscaping is preparing a kind of a readiness for a weather. It's not an identity in that sense, but I'm not sure. No, these are just tentative images. And say that then this architectonic involution can be approached with words or with a reason that doesn't produce hope. I think to relate this, so a treatise upon this is the key term as grammatology. A treatise upon this, a grammatology, because he said we need to mobilize writing. It's a treatise upon letters would be base which would facilitate mobilization writing. And his claim that this gap between being and existence for which Heidegger stands, its main problem is that it has always thought of writing as being relative to speech. And the speech is related to a presence that remains with the metaphysics. And Derrida's gesture is to say, actually, there is a writing, an archive, which we need to think prior to that. And this writing is a gesture quite similar to the critical rationality of Popper. If we now say, okay, writing comes before, and we think it through natural communication, so through information physics. No? So nature itself communicates through writing. So information, when everything receives it, stores it, sends it, and so on, is writing, speaking. So then this problem or his approach is gone. No? I think this is the moment when this kind of thinking can actually become an ethics, because without that it produces moralism. But how can this, but then what can we do? No? So because then we didn't further. If we say, okay, information physics, natural communication is somehow the nature to be treated in a treatise upon letter. Because then that would be to address nature as nature. And we will see this is one of the beautiful things he will say, of course, we need to nature as nature. But the way we can do that is through art. And this way through art involves engage with a non-human element. You see this in the citations. Because then the human element in which we think becomes part of the nature we study nature. And the human element what he does with the meridian is to say we need to think about nature and about the human in the inclination angle of existence. And the inclination angle of it, so this entails between being and existence, there is a construction or the consciousness that is forming itself of the cosmos, between being and existence. And this between being and existence, again, is a gesture which I skipped before, which is which also guides Popper in a beautiful way. So one of the receptions of this of the past, no, the illusion would be to say, okay, they have the sun and the moon, and it's radiant and full of light, the body which emits, and the moon doesn't have any other radiance. It just reflects, but it's being produced on it. So the moon, in a moralized history of she always stands for false knowledge, for illusion, for submission to authority, and so on. And Popper, he begins to say, the one line that he takes from Parmenides' poem is that the moon, we need to think of the moon as actively looking at the rays of the sun. Yeah? So the moon is passive in reflecting, but in order to reflect, it actively follows the sun rays of Helios. So it has an attention which is active, which is not purely passive. So it's a rehabilitation of the moon, or you could say an arrangement to include the moon together with the sun in this kind of critical rationalism, an appreciation of it. It's interesting that he bothers, and I don't know what is this, but it's interesting to note in the German language, it seems to be almost the only language where the moon is male and the sun is female. And Popper is very much bothered by that. He wants to turn it around, and he says, you know, rather than we need to change the genders in the German names. And how we can do this is we could just speak of the moon goddess and God. No, it's a bit, but this again is tempered reason. No, it's not logical. It's not a decision which is imposed. He tries to make it acceptable. Yeah. So, but it's clear how much with it for a lot of things. So it's about appreciating the moon, or this kind of so that in reflection there is an activity as well. Yeah. So, and now with this we can go to the, so then we have this, so the meridian in the inclination angle of existence, and the inclination angle is only because the cosmic self is a self that manifests as existence. It's not the universe, so it's a decorum. So we have this inclination angle of the way that we model architectonically existence, knowing that existence, but how we model it will never be coextensive to the universality of being that it actually models. So there's a cut, there's a separation. But then the question is, and this is now one of the key ideas in Michel Serres, and I never knew how to think of it. So he was asking for a general treatise on sculpture. This is in his second book of Foundation, which is called Statues. And one way, of course, to think of it is that statues for are indexing what is absent, what has been here but is no longer. So it's a kind of a memory from forgetting. It's interesting because a gravestone or a sculpture is very much about keeping present narratively what it was. So to kind of index or initiate a recitation or a circulation, positive, and trying to grasp it or to hold on to it. So a letting go through memory, and a gesture of a letting go through a kind of to engage with, I think is what is at stake when he says a general treatise sculpture. And difficulty is how to make sense of this general. The way that I want to think about it for now is that this general precisely needs to pertain to the cosmos, which acquires a kind of consciousness. So it's a general treatise of sculpture because this cosmos is modeled as we have it. No, we have the two poles. We have the equator, meridians, we have the latitudes. So then it's okay. What we have is the equator, which is usually a tropical line as well, because there you can turn into everything. There homogeneous of cloud. It's the only place you can see the whole star. You can see all the stars in this equator. And to think of it as an algebraic reference for a metaphoric kind of equations. So that would not be a treatise on sculpture, a general treatise on morphosis or something like that. No, you would be with the dynamics. But it makes cuts. It exposes things and hands them over to the passing of time. So it cannot be a kinetics or a theory of movement. So then we is to think of the theater as a metronome at work in how we engage with time through literary reason. And the metronome, you know, it gives a steady tact. A metronome is not itself chronological or achronical. So to think of it as a metronome, and then we can think of the inclination angle of existence as the meridian, which crosses the equator, and then the figures that take form in a sculpture, they appear somewhere, no, in the inclination angle, where the meridian crosses the equator, and there is some location, but it's not a location because we don't have a space for this. No. So it's a place, I would say. That's a place. So the figure takes place somewhere in the inclination angle of existence. Yeah, okay. So that's the kind of scope in which I'm interested in Handke and Celan. So then, this gesture of thinking under the inclination angle of existence about sculpture in a way, through literary reason and mathematical thinking, begins to foreground quotation in a really interesting way. Quotation, I will see, so my point is that there is the time to such a concept that recites itself, basically, in the impersonal voice in which we seek knowledge or truth, is a time that springs from the gesture of erzählen. And erzählen is in English often translated as recounting or narrating, but what is counting and counting in erzählen? But then these tenses be the tenses that temper existence and rationalized. There is truth in them. Can't be. And this is what Handke's book is all about. We will see Handke's book, how he is. And he says, so there is existence, exists in Erzählung. Etwas die nur in der Erzählung existieren. So this book, The Bildverlust, is a story. I wouldn't call it a novel. It's a story which treats of which exists only in encounter. So who can write such? Who can be a protagonist? No? The interesting thing, and this is where, so that goes beyond my constellation with which I grasp. The protagonist is a woman. He says it's the first time that a woman can actually be a protagonist in literature. It's epic. And these tenses temper things which exist only in encounting are epic tenses. So adventure circuitous. Don't go out in the world. It's an adventure which where the ad works like paying a tribute in this event. So it's a kind of an advent event and relates through paying tributes attributes is not back or an owing or anything like that. It's what with the meridian, and this term Celan introduced. He was speaking of a breath of the Atemwende, and he was speaking of counter words, Gegenworte. Gegenworten as a verb, actually, so to counter words actively, and Gegenbildern. So this is, so that rather than to rationally reason it, you sort it up by going counter, but it is going to happen. Something like that. And there is, so this instance, if you look at the energy of it, it literally means a standing force, a coming, hearing. System X is the change, and sister A is to remain, to be fixed. So existence really becomes to be in a certain way. So that's the first. Then what does it mean to something? It means to summon, to call upon officially, urge, in a sudden motion, go forward, rouse, excite, to cite. To cite it with copy, no? That was the first thing for me, which was really powerful, to say the copy is not the static duplicate. It's not a dull representation. Copy comes from copious, and copiousness is empty. It means transcription, writing in. So it's a copy is made the model of this very duplicate. It's where out of anything you figure out how to make this. Gesture copying. And something similar now can happen quoting and quotations or citations. And this is the way I want to think of the place. So citing, then when we look at quotation, what it literally means, the numbering, a notation, quotation. So, but the numbering is important. This has to do with this Erzählen, with the end counting. Number, quotare. And quoting or citing is only from here. Passage is quoted. So they become accountable. No? What we quote becomes accountable. Does it become accountable? There must be a reason which it be accountable, because accountable means you rationalize it. But if you rationalize it, it needs an end in the air or existence that happens. Yeah. It's not being as logical opposites, no? Or as being in position, but as of perhaps something like the education must have some impersonal. It's not about so much, but then how can a quote a counter word producing or something like that? So it would be a kind of production of it, a reproduction of it. Quote can be a reproduction which must be copious in the sense of out of the abundant possibilities. And this comes, another term which Cesare always uses, usually this narrative. Not a narrative in that sense. It literally means to decide, to again, so to some which involves what I call landscape, no? So detailing. So an account is detailing, a recital. It's not just a quotation, recital. So you detail it. It's like You know, when you have a paint, so a motif and you make a painting, perhaps. It's a detail involved. And this detail refers or introduces or opens up a public. It's no longer strictly private. A public reading or a judicial decrease of literature. So to recite something is not, so the quotations, we do it silently when we write, no? And recitation is it involves publicness and a speech. And there is a way to statement, no, or with this setup, not through logical argument, reason state, also not through construction, but through recitation. And this recitation has an active, so we can't lay things to the memory of history, no, where it will be preserved. It involves an active keeping present, but in a, what I want to suggest, like a statue helps to keep present what we want to remember in order to let go. And this, I would say, is the relation in which Michel Serres relates to this Big Bang story, so to the Chronopedia, to the Le Grand Récit. And I understand now that to even evoke is really, because almost everybody understands it. But in such a, as a récit, it's not an origin, it has to do with recitation, with recitation. And it's a recitation which talks in public, so it's true or false, involves the moon and the sun, and it accommodates places in the, no? So it's a humanism. Please.
I think it's more strong.
Yeah.
It's about giving a voice to something that you have learned by heart.
Yeah, that's a good. Because learning by heart, it has a lot to do. It's like it's a way to teach poetry anymore, no? So I still has poems that she just had to learn. And poems, I mean, she never wanted to reason this in a literary way, but they are like a talisman or something like that. So, and they live with you, and you don't, and they live by learning by heart means precisely you don't need to you don't listen them. They accompany you. No, there's something like plus the Mitvergangenheit. No, so when we reason, we be in the perfect tense. There are the things we learn by heart and we bring along. And this has this dimension of the heart, I think, has a lot to do with intuition, actually. And it's how rationalization doesn't go to it. Advances makes intuition more capacious and more sensible at the same time. So yeah. Yes. So now we come to Celan. And Derrida does, because he does something. He was the one who drew attention to the data of dates of dating in Celan and of quotation. And the text he wrote, which he titled Shibboleth, splitting of people, no? And it's quite telling that out of beautiful, fragile things, Celan tries to achieve and makes the gesture, no? Of organizing the territory, of having operated to organize the territory. So I don't like Derrida, I must. I know many people do. And I mean, the subject is enormous. There's no way, if you want to learn to think today in these things, Derrida. But ethically, what he does, I really, really don't like. So what he does of Celan is to read these things in terms of an operator of organizing belongings. But what he foregrounds thereby, and that's where Derrida's deconstruction always kind of refused to think of itself as philosophy, because it gave, but it's like a speaking sacred. But it would say in literature, literature can do more than philosophy ever can. And it's because in literature, there is, he goes with a fundamental mission of writing without a date, of writing that it's coming into existence. Yeah, so, but then literature puts dates which are not the dates of history. So what he appreciates, Heidegger, what they appreciate is that they begin to date, so to place events, but in a space or in a reality or in an illusion or in whatever we want to call it, which is not that of history. But all writing is a dating. And then the other key terms, there is a couple that he introduces together with this notion of dating, on one hand. So not the impersonal voice, but the authority of an I, the signature. The other is, now I forgot, the signature and the proper name, so the Eigenname. And in Celan's, we will see this in a moment, in Celan's writing, just like his writing, can be no, Handke instructs the author never true. No? So this author can only write what is totally imagined. But it needs to write about what is actually happening. So we will see. So the things which for Derrida give this sacredness to literature is precisely what both Celan and Handke. In Celan, it's always a place, the writings of indicated. We can leave it. No, but what is interesting is that by giving this to how Celan can actually introduce dates, because the upsetting thing is that Celan writes a poetry which uses dates that are explicit. So like the 12th of January at noon or something like that. It's not on a winter day. It's not on a general level. It's on a level. This actuality in Celan is an actuality which is not that of a space of analysis, but it is that the world exposed to a weather and the climate in this meridian domain. And this is of the accents. So how you, the pronunciations in your articulations. So he will this presence in the sense of an acute, an acutes presence, an accents. And this accents is switched toward forms of they're called it's a whole international vocabulary of how they use and the graph. So all these, so they are really make sense. So they're not involved with the letter. A treatise letters cannot get acts because they are like flags in the wind or something like that. They respond to. It's not part of the letter that I was looking for. Let's see. Yeah, but let's maybe start with the this is how it starts. It's a very short speech that he gave. He received a prize And he begins like this. Art, you will remember, is a puppet-like, iambic, 5-footed thing without, and this last characteristic has its mythological Pygmalion and without. So the role of art that he will talk about is that it is only through passing through art that we can attend and speak about nature as go to art. Art, puppet-like, offspring. So there is no natural reproduction in art. And the way that he thinks of poetics, of his meridian poetics, has to do with a kind of ring then which works through the quotation, which is the memory, which is the statues, which I think go through kind of an involute, say, no? It's going the other way from reproducing itself in genealogies. It travels the other way to any kind of yes, good. Then one of the things in such a is that it's about encounters, but the encounters have something to do with this. This this is the thing, no? So this time, which qualifies the 10 things that exist in Erzählung. This time, they happen by what I call attribution. Attribute is what we call a sum paid trust. If we add something, the trust of this thing being capable of giving protection. Qualities that are attributes. That's the main distinction. No? So it's another language game of speaking of properties, because if things exist in it, we still need to describe them. So how do we describe them? Of the copiousness that wants to present, to forget in order to articulate it ourselves. So qualities of things that are attributed are properties, being they don't strictly belong where they manifest and express themselves, but they are also not insubstantial for this thing's mode of existing. Attribution literally for one, taking a tribute, the price for buying protection as a sum. So that will be with hand, it's about capitals. This Erzählung, so the narrative, the protagonist need to have intimate relation. So as a allotting this price as a summoning trigger something as this characteristic temper or temperament. So not the property, but a temperament, and this has the place in the Erzählung, of course. I call these tenses inter, but this is not right. Yeah, it's not fully, but intertidal, and this would into the earthly scale of the, so the moon and they kind of produce a turnover. So the tenses that happen or qualify this between the times. this kind of swelling, destroying, as well as destroying. So that's Okay, do I need to do something with the microphone? Okay.
I don't know why microphone was connected.
Okay, hey Jorge. Good. So it's about these quotations. Huh? So the quotations thought through the copiousness. So the quotations don't reproduce, but become manifestation of the stance of art through which we can attend to nature as nature. In a time of encounting, so erzählen, and it has something to do with, I called it here beschwören, I'm not sure, it's this attribution, no? If the tempus, so the times relative to this encounting, the tenses, they attribute to the things which they articulate, rather than describing their properties. So that's the term. In a voice of a self that cannot say I. So this, so then a quotation becomes an encounter. That's maybe an important link. So then in Celan, there is an interesting focus on attention. And this tribute has, yeah, maybe there is a relation between attention as a tribute. So it's because it's not an attention, it can't be an individual attention really, no? So it needs to be an impersonal kind of attention. What he writes, let's get into the text a bit. The attention which the poem pays. So his question is, how is a poem then, or what can a poem do, or poetics do with regard to this role of art, which allows us to think about the world and ourselves in the inclination angle of existence, set up in a meridian poetics. So the attention which the poem pays to all that it encounters. So the poem can encounter things in the meridian because it's figurative. So it doesn't just voice what is kind of what inspires it, but rather than having an inspiration directly, inspiration comes from an encounter which the poem tries to remember through forgetting. So the attention which the poem pays to all that it encounters, its more acute sense of detail, outline, structure, color, but also of the tremors and hints. All this is not, I think, achieved by an eye competing or concurring with ever more precise instruments, but rather by a kind of concentration mindful of all our dates. Attention, if you allow me to quote from Malebranche via Walter Benjamin's essay on Kafka, attention is the natural prayer of the soul. And this soul would be that of the cosmic self. No? The cosmos as a self which cannot say I. The poem becomes, under what conditions? The poem of a person who still perceives, still turns towards phenomena, addressing and questioning them. The poem becomes conversation, often desperate conversation. So this conversation, it comes from versatile, from versing, so from turning around, but turning around together. So that's the encounter which is not about recognizing. It's an encounter which is not about recognizing what happens, but a conversation, so a turning together. And the place of this turning together is what he calls the meridian poetics, as I understand it. And then in a way, such encounters have on the one hand to do with turning things to stone, and on the other hand with encountering a self. So it has to do, and encountering has to do with a witness, with a witnessing. And this witnessing is the stance where through art we can attend to nature as nature. Okay, but he writes here. So the view of art with a scene. So I think it's Büchner he's talking about here, I'm not sure. It's about how to illustrate such a view of art with a scene. And he cites this one here. As I was walking in the valley yesterday, I saw two girls sitting on a rock. One was putting up her hair and the other helped. The golden hair hanging down and the pale, serious face, so very young, and the black dress, and the other girl so careful and attentive. Even the finest, most intimate paintings of the old German masters can hardly give you an idea of the scene. Sometimes one would like to be a Medusa's head to turn such a group to stone and gather the people around it. And then the important addition, please note, one would like to be a Medusa's head, to seize the natural as the natural by means of art. One would like to, by the way, not I would. So this is this turn with the voice. And maybe because it is a bit painful to read Celan in the English translation. Let's just look at this one passage so you have the sound of the German words. They're just different. I'm not saying it's a bad translation, but it's just different. So what he's interested in with this understanding of art is to free art again from its genius cult of idealism. So he cites Büchner because they have verächtliche Worte. So verächtlich means verächtlich. Mépris, is that it in French? No. Verächtlich means disrespectful, something like that. Yeah, but it's more than disrespectful. Yeah. For art. No. So the German passage is, wie ich gestern neben am Tal hinaufging, ja schon dies, no? Neben am Tal, sah ich auf einem Stein zwei Mädchen sitzen. Die eine band ihr Haar auf, die andere half ihr. Und das goldene Haar hing herab und ein ernstes, bleiches Gesicht und doch so jung und die schwarze Tracht und die andere so sorgsam bemüht. These are all they're fragmentary, so they don't, there's no causality. Yeah? But it's neither narrating nor descriptive. So in terms of this text linguistics, it doesn't make the tempus explicit. And this is the turning to stone gesture that he is looking for. Meine Damen und Herren, beachten Sie bitte, man möchte ein Medusenhaupt sein, das Natürliche als das Natürliche mittels der Kunst zu erfassen. Man möchte, heißt es hier freilich, nicht ich möchte. So you see the tonality in which he writes is a very distant one, and this tonality specifically is lost in the translation, unfortunately, and it gives the temper of the whole thing. So it's a crucial aspect. But I don't want to be pedantic, so we go with the English. The passage continues. So here, no. So one would like to, by the way, not I would. And then it's this one here. This means going beyond what is human, stepping into a realm which is turned towards the human, but uncanny. The realm where the monkey, the automatons, and with them, art too, seem to be at home. This is not the historical lens speaking, but Büchner's. Here we hear Büchner's, so yeah, you see the dating and the citing and so on. So then, yeah, here I have the German passage, but I can translate because I think circumscribing is better than trying to make it smooth here. So with this gesture of an attention which goes beyond what is human, stepping into a realm which is turned towards the human in the meridian. So it's uncanny. It's like, so art doesn't have offspring, so it's puppet-like. It's mechanic. So that's the distance it takes to the idealism. But then, what is Dichtung? What is Dichtung? Poetry. And then he says, it can mean a turn of breath. Das kann eine Atemwende bedeuten. Wer weiß, vielleicht legt die Dichtung den Weg, auch den Weg der Kunst, einer solchen Atemwende Wille zurück. So it can mean a breath turn. Perhaps poetry follows a path. So there is a method to poetry, follows a path. Perhaps also the path of art, devoted to such a breath turn. Perhaps poetry succeeds, da das Fremde, also der Abgrund und das Medusenhaut, der Abgrund und die Automaten, ja, in eine Richtung zu liegen scheint. Vielleicht gelingt es ihr hier zwischen fremd und fremd zu unterscheiden. This again, no, so, okay. Perhaps it succeeds because that which is foreign, so the abyss and the head of the Medusa, the abyss and its automatons, they appear to lie in a certain direction. So therefore, because they appear to lie in a certain direction, the path of poetry perhaps succeeds to make distinctions between foreign and foreign, not self and strange, no? or me and other. Foreign and foreign, fremd und fremd. Vielleicht schrumpft gerade hier das Medusenhaupt, vielleicht versagen gerade hier die Automaten für diesen einmaligen kurzen Augenblick. So perhaps in separating or distinguishing foreign and foreign, it is when or where the head of the Medusa, which can turn things to stone, dissolves or schrumpft, becomes very small. Perhaps it is here that automata will fail for this very short moment. Vielleicht wird hier mit dem Ich, mit dem hier und solcher Art freigesetzten, befremdeten Ich, vielleicht wird hier noch ein anderes frei. So perhaps it is here with this I, with the I which has been set free in an alienated, in a foreignized way. Perhaps this is the setting free of another, ein anderes. Vielleicht ist das Gedicht von daher es selbst und kann nun auf diese kunstlose, kunstfreie Weise seine anderen Wege, also auch die Wege der Kunst gehen, wieder und wieder gehen vielleicht. So perhaps a poem can, starting from here, can itself, in a way that is artless, free of art, follow other paths, perhaps even the path of art, again and again and again, perhaps. So how to think of this? He calls it Toposforschung, search for topoi, for places. But how to attend to places? In the light of that which one researches, which one searches for. And the light of that is the light of a utopia. And then how to think of the human in the light and the creature in the light of utopia. But then what you see in the light of utopia is images. So how to think of images? Sorry. Das einmal, wieder einmal und nur jetzt und nur hier wahrgenommene und wahrzunehmende. So that which once, again and again once, just now and here, so topos, place, not location and space, perceived and perceptible. Und das Gedicht wäre somit der Ort, wo alle Tropen und Metaphern ad absurdum geführt werden wollen. So the poem would be the place where all tropes and metaphors want to be led into absurdity. So the tropical line in the expansion of the cosmos of such a meridian poetics. The tropical line, the equator, where we have a space of morphings. So what these encounters cannot have names, no? So it has no definitive name, but I believe that instead of definitive name, it is poetry. So I know we can read it in different ways. We can give it a variety of accents. And here is the important thing to these tenses, to the time. So to give it, so the encounters, what manifest or the witnessing happens in giving accents, not recognizing the names, no, or the nouns or the properties. And this variety of accents, he opens up a space of the acute of the present, the grave accent of history, and the circumflex of eternity. So, and the variety of accentuating a pronunciation in a poem is, so the inclination angle manifests in these accents, and these accents pronounce the tempi of the tenses. So the past, no, history, eternity, and the acute presence. So then here he gives an account, this is a bit later, towards the end, he gives an account of such an encounter. And he writes, a year ago, I commemorated a missed encounter in the Engadine Valley, because these encounters will always be missed. No? That's how the Medusa is the turning to stone. So it's not about remembering in a narrative sense what happens in these encounters. So they're missed encounters, and yet they happen. In the Engadine Valley, by putting a little story on paper where I had a man like Lenz, here you see, it cannot be proper names. No, it's the writers, it's their poems. It has always, it's dealing with dating and with naming, but never properly. A man like Lenz walked through the mountains. Both times I had written from a 20th of January, from my 20th of January, I had encountered myself. So by writing this encounter of someone like Lenz, it's about the self, no? But yeah. But it's a self which would like sometimes to be a Medusa head, to turn things to stone. So not the individual I. It is on such paths that poems take us when we, is it on such paths that poems take us when we think of them? And are these paths only detours from you to you? But they are, among how many others, the path on which language becomes voice. They are encounters, paths from a voice to a listening you, natural paths, outlines for existence, perhaps, for projecting ourselves into the search for ourselves, a kind of a homecoming. So it's a cycle, no? So there's the alienation of the places where from the individual self, it's about becoming this impersonal self, but this impersonal self is also, yeah, a kind of a homecoming in his understanding in the world. So, but this is quite sad. And he ends, these are the last two slides with which he ends this speech. Ladies and gentlemen, I find something which consoles me a bit for having walked this impossible road in your presence, this road of the impossible. So if you want, this road of the impossible is one which tunes perhaps, no, the Parmenides path of the illusion and the truth. It's an impossible one. So it's not possible to advance on the truth path without producing the illusion path. But it's precisely this impossibility which he wants to make, which he wants to talk about, and of which he says poetry can. I find the connective, which, like the poem, leads to encounters. I find something as immaterial as language, yet earthly, terrestrial, in the shape of a circle, which, via both poles, rejoins itself and on the way serenely crosses even the tropics. I find a meridian. With you and Georg Büchner and the state of Hesse, I believe I have just touched it again. So the encounters are possible because one touches upon the meridian. And the meridian is something as immaterial as language in his thinking, but the language which doesn't refer to an absent origin, but an earthly, a terrestrial in the shape of a circle. And this shape of the circle, no, with two poles, this is now what I would like to develop into a cosmic approach with what would be the world then of the meridian poetics? What would be this world? So the architectonic gesture. And with this, we can go to Handke now.
Vera, could you just have a question for you?
Yes, please.
So for me, it just was hard time imagining was this attention. I find it very strong and also desperateness in it, and then kind of impersonal attention. Natural. And I'm thinking, how would this relate to the geometry as it is placed in Michel Serres' idea of history? Is this attention something geometrical, perhaps, or could be seen in this slide, or is it completely not related?
No, I would say it's a lot related to it. It's so I think there is a joint interest, but on different, perhaps scalarities or ways of being in the world. And the one out of which Celan speaks is a desperate place. That's clear. It's a desperate place, and the desperation turns into this poetic voice, trying to find another way than judging, no, what makes it so desperate. Perhaps we can say like that. And for Serres, this desperateness is much less existential, I would say. So there's much more comfort in the world in which Serres thinks the similar things. But there's also a desperation at the core in Serres. So Serres is optimist always and so on, but this optimism doesn't come of a lightheartedness. And that's where the poetic gesture in Serres is what I always liked a lot. No? So you have this gravity, but you don't try to be recognized in this gravity. You invent to make it light. No? So you always invent to not share the desperation. This sounds desperate again. Yeah, I'm sorry. But, yeah, I don't know.
But somehow when it's impersonal and yet desperate, this is for me a little bit like, I don't know what to make. Yes, sorry, I just
no, yeah. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and yeah. So then the thing to think about would be desperation. No? I've never thought of that. Yeah. So to make, yeah. Yeah, let's see. Yeah. So I'm afraid Handke is desperate too. It will not get much light. In a way, yes, no, but in a way not. So what Handke tries to think is in a so yeah, maybe this is not the best way to start. So the story by Handke is it's the story of, wait, I did not. Maybe let's start so you get. It's a story actually connecting to a moment of desperation. It comes out of a moment of desperation. It comes out from, so the protagonist of the story ceases to have images. No? So that's the loss of images. And she wants her story, and it's a story which means living through images. She wants this story to be told because the images no longer come. So that's the point with existence only in Erzählung, in encounting. So it's a story which tries to do the impossible. This is from the early part of the book. He writes, and then these traces too faded away. The images no longer came on their own accord. She had to make an effort to summon them, and as a result, they remained devoid of meaning. At most, they turned up in an occasional dream, and eventually they too vanished from her dreams. That country no longer pursued her. She did not have a country of her own, and another country either, including this one here. And that was fine with her, perfectly fine. The eternities spent in foreign parts seemed to have shaped her, enhancing her beauty, and not only the beauty of her face. A clear, frost-cold night in early January on the outskirts of a northern riverport city. What was the name of the city, of the country? The author she had hired to write a book. So that's it. She needs to hire an author. It's an authorship relation which is entirely based on paying somebody by contracting him to write her story, which is the story that nobody can imagine because it's the story that lives only through the images which have ceased to come on their own accord. So if you want, it's the setup for finding a way out of a similar desperation. The author she had hired to write a book about her undertakings and her adventures had been forbidden from the very beginning to use names. In a pinch, he could use place names, but it had to be made clear at once that they were usually false, altered, or invented. Here and there, the author, with whom she had negotiated a standard delivery contract, would also be free to toss in a real name. In any case, future readers were to confine themselves to following the larger story, and the story and the manner of its telling were calculated to make them free to forget. From the moment they turned the first page, any thoughts they might have had of hunting for clues or sniffing around. No? So it's the analytical quest, trying to find the causes and to link up the dots, which the reader must alienate from, must cut. Yeah, if possible, the first sentence of a book, and the first sentence is always a very important one, of course. This first sentence of a book would banish any such overt or ulterior motives in favor of reading pure and simple. So it's a kind of an impredicate reading. It continues. According to the contract, the same prohibition applied to names of persons and indications of time. Persons' names were admissible only when they were clearly products of the imagination. What imagination, the author? The imagination appropriate to a specific adventure and to love. Whose love? Mine. And indications of time only of this sort, one winter morning on a summer night, the following fall at Easter time in the middle of the war. So place indexes. For a long while now, she had hardly any relatives left. And those, so now it's the ancestor, who is she? So then, okay, we can't name anything real, but then what is real about her? She has had hardly any relatives left, and those who were still alive were out of sight and out of mind. Somewhere, where? How should I know? She allegedly still had a half-brother who allegedly rented out recreational vehicles or was a microchip technician, or perhaps both. Yet for many years, she had made her ancestors, starting with her parents, of whom she had no conscious memories, the objects of a quiet, private, and all the more fervent cult. These ancestors were the possible exception, with the possible exception of her grandparents, who for a long time were entirely too present, constituted, thanks to stories, no matter how fragmentary, indeed, precisely because they were fragmentary, and then also dreams. So they constituted the love for which she wept anew, often daily, during a good 24 summers and even more winters. Did she long for her ancestors? Yes, yet not to be with them, but merely to be able to look in on them for a moment, to comfort them, to thank them, and to bow down before them, after taking the appropriate step back. And then these shadowy ancestors had lost all their hold over her. So the desperateness, or the cutting, or the not lending things to history, of course, has to do with the relation to the ancestors through this moment of a statue, which keeps a memory present through letting go, through forgetting. So, and then these shadowy ancestors had lost all their hold over her, and that too had happened ever so gradually. Some summer or winter morning, she had realized that her venerated dead belonged to the gazillions of those who were no longer present, having seeped into the ground since the dawn of time, crumbled or blown away to the four corners of the earth, never to be recalled, never to be brought to life by any love whatsoever, irrecoverable for all eternity. They still turned up now and then in dreams, but only as a part of a crowd, under a heading of also present. This now and then no longer had the meaning it once had, possessed of at all sacred times. So this is the begin. So that's what I want to get at. It's a way that the time of this narration and the tenses of these narrations are the tenses actually of a present, which he calls acute as well. The akute Gegenwart in German, and it involves formulations. So they give you a bit of the language game with which Handke establishes. So an akute Gegenwart, an acute presence, and then to be lost in an actual time. Now, how can one be lost in an actual time? Then it's to speak the word of eine andere, another time, or to disappear out of the mind with the passing of time. So mit der Zeit aus dem Sinn geraten. Then Beginn der Zeiten, a beginning of the Zeiten. How would you translate that? Of the ages, something like that. Then zu allen heiligen Zeiten, so there are many, no? So at the point in time to all the sacred times, or then in just this one time, or in the whole of time, or in the course of time, over a longer course of time, and in Gleichmaß, in an adequate measure, no, not adequate, in an equal measure. So over the longer time, but in equal measure, during her time, today, as much as ages ago, heute, so wie vor Zeiten. Then he speaks of a time atom, ein Zeitatom, In einem Zeitatom geschehende Übergänge. He speaks of passages which happen within a time atom. He speaks of, mit dem Zusatz anderer Zeiten, die Gegenwart, wie sie immer gewesen war. So, the present, as it has always been, but under the attribution of different times. And then dieses größere Jetzt, die größere Zeit. This larger now, the larger time, die größere Zeit. And this largeness, he calls it das Gehege der größeren Zeit. Das Gehege is something like a, what is ein Gehege? Cage, park, something like that. Yeah? So das Gehege, it's like for when you go see the deers that are not free in the forest. So it's a Gehege. Das Gehege der größeren Zeit, das hinter dem Sturmwirrwarr jene Gegenwart als Park, als Garten. Yeah, so the time which is behind this storm, this stormy chaos of just this present, behind it, is it a park, is it a garden, is it a reserve, eine Schonung, ein Gehege, a container. Then time as something precious, so Kostbarkeit und Köstlichkeit. Köstlich is something you taste, or something tastes, I don't know the English word. Delicious, yes. Delicious, so time becomes precious and delicious, or can be. And then to be famous, that's her main thing. So to be famous for always having time. And this always having time is what the images give her. So that's how she lives through the images. Through the images, she's always busy and yet always has time at the same time.
Before the translation between the page, what was interesting about the instance of the German Hegel, which is about cat.
Yes. Yeah. And this gets lost with the cage, huh? But it is also a kind of a containing at the same time. Mm-hmm. So being famous for having time, and then das Gehege der Größen, then this Gehege, so this Gehege of the larger time, it's where the wind blows through, rafting the rafting of air. Then eine Reise im Gehege, eine Schatzsuche. So to travel in this Gehege, traveling turns into the quest for a treasure, but it's a treasure not for her. The treasure that orients the quest is a treasure for everyone else. It's das endgültige Unterwegssein. So being in passage in a finally valid sense. Endgültig. Endgültig is it's not the same like absolute. No? It's endgültig is so gültig means valid in a final sense. But an adjective qualifying the being in passage. Die Zeit des Herabschüttelns und Erntens, it's the time of harvesting and of letting things fall down. He calls it eine grundandere Zeit. This is grundander. So it's not just a fundamentally different time. Grundanders means the reason changes. It's the time of a different rationality. Grundandere Zeit. Die Epoche, die Zeit einer Geschichte. So he says, okay, a story actually has an own time, and this own time manifests as an epoch. I will come to this. So these terms of episode, epochs, and also periods, they become crucial for organizing the tenses in which she works. Durcheinander wirbelnde Zeiten. So times or tenses which go through and through, no? which get mixed up, mingled up. So this is just starting a quick search, but the vocabulary of how time is present is very alien and very, very interesting. And it has to do with this contract of paying somebody to write the impossible story of her. And it's impossible because the story unfolds and is nourished from the images, but the images cease to come on their own accord. So what the author actually is supposed to achieve with this task of writing is to make an instrument that can accord them to come. And this instrument that can accord them to come needs to tell the story of her. And she is, so the story that he will need to talk about is that of being, she is called the Queen of Finance. So that's the narrative identity she gets. She's a banker, a very important one. And she, there is a relation of the way that she thinks of giving credit and of dealing with capital. So she is a capital, no, not a capitalist. She is a capital through this relation of the images with the relation to the credit. And it's, so then this story which lives through the images is the story, if you want, of capitalism as a story. No? So to bring capitalism to a human scale, that's one way to read or to put it into a constellation. And so these images, so what her life that he would tell is about her relation to these images. So let's see how the book talks about that. Such images came to her daily, especially in the morning hours. She lived off them, drawing from them her most powerful sense of being alive. They were not memories, either voluntary or involuntary. These images flashed before her too suddenly, like lightning or meteors, and refused to be slowed or brought to a halt, let alone captured. If you wanted to stop them and contemplate them at leisure, they had long since evaporated. And with such interferences, you would also destroy the lasting effect of the image, which had appeared for a fraction of a second, darted through you and vanished just as abruptly. What effect did the images have? They ennobled the day for her. They ratified the present for her. She lived off them, which also meant that she used them and made good use of them. She even employed them for her work, her ventures, her deals. If she had an almost magical, legendary, as a certain newspaper article puts it, a magical ability to focus on the matter at hand, so this attention, to display supernatural presence of mind at the decisive moment, not only having all the facts and figures in her head, but also dazzling her partner or counterpart in negotiations by serving them up as a numerical witch's brew. She owed this talent to something she had not yet revealed to any interviewer. And what words would she have chosen? Namely, to the intervention of these images in hers in her workday. So it's a kind of a work. So the image, capital, and work get connected in this protagonist whose story cannot be told. Does this mean that the images were subject to her will, after all, there to be summoned at will or as needed? No, they remained unpredictable, but over time she had discovered various methods of activating her reserves. It was not a question of specific techniques, certainly not of tricks, but rather of fundamental attitudes and the whole way of living. Yes, she had aligned her whole life, not merely her profession and her existence as a queen of finance, to accommodate these shooting images. What fundamental attitudes and behaviors were especially productive in this regard? She, who by nature or by virtue of her profession was little given to shyness, proved shy when it came to speaking of such matters, but she could offer hints, a kind of mindfulness. Yeah, and so on. So now let's see how this connects to capital. Okay, this is repetitive. We already had it. Here, perhaps. So the image is being switched off after a microsecond and at most had a bit of an afterglow, was tangible and accessible to both the senses and the mind, both leaving an aftertaste and clarifying one's thought processes. Was each image, albeit surrounded as now, and undergirded by a glow of mist continuity, a treasure that would never be lost, even if one allowed a particular image to disappear again, without making a point of tasting and contemplating it. And a treasure whose value, she of course knew all about value, exceeded anything one could ever have in life or call one's own. The fundamentals underlying any goods, love, loyalty, including to oneself. Was loyalty a good? Beauty and goodness. Was goodness a good? Renunciation. Was renunciation a good? And of course, peace. So in a way, it means it makes this radical link between ein Gut, which is subject to price and to money and to economy, and a good, which is a virtue. At any rate, each image among the thousands was under the control of its receiver, even if it had flashed by in the twinkling of an eye, as if the receiver were also the transmitter. What remained of the image was the imprint, which before it faded, sooner or later, and in some cases not at all, in this respect it is comparable to an unusual dream, could bear fruit, and this without exception. Whereas in dreams, this was the exception. And one could decide which of these images would bear fruit, as the selection and utilization of those just described rested on the intensely personal choice made by the one image person in question. So what I'm fascinated or interested in with this is that this idea, in the beginning, so to pursue the quest of truth or philosophy or science presupposes to become impersonal, to cut the umbilical cord of one's historical and subjective identity, so to speak in an impersonal voice, but as the voice of the cosmic self. So there can be many impersonal voices. These impersonal voices are not the same. And this, I think, is what Handke, with this constellation of being an image person, wants to articulate. But then this being an image person is, so how can one then speak impersonally about being an image person? And here now comes this relation to an epos, also finance, which literally also means speaking of the end. No? So finance it has the end in itself. So finance with an epos, finance and epos. I think that's the constellation of these capital images. He writes those images. She dictated, for the moment, more a banquier than an aventurière, so an adventure, so a banker, so a feminine banker, than an adventurer. She says those images are a form of capital, a form of capital. But capital is the equator, no? Capital is the anything, nothing, the operator, a form of capital. These images are a form of capital. Capital without any exchange value. So so traveling in this world is a quest for a treasure, eine Schatzsuche, but the treasure can never be lost, and it doesn't belong. So it's a search for a treasure, which we need to think differently, atmospherically, climatically, or something like that. Capital without any exchange value, but with all the more use value. Capital whose owner one remains only if one chooses to use it to the utmost. If one allows this capital to sit unused, it collapses. And this is the unique feature of these movable or immovable images, image assets. Wait, does this connect? This is the unique feature. So if one allows this capital to sit unused, it collapses. And my most liquid holdings, and at the same time, my soundest real estate, one collapses with it, even if the opposite appears to be true. Having and owning as a process of constant trading, yet not speculating and lining one's pockets, but rather pure usufruct, as much to one's own benefit as to others. by putting the image capital to work. And why shouldn't one? For profit and enrichment. Yeah. So it's a capital for which there is use value, but no exchange value, but it needs to be put to work with and for profit and enrichment. Shared profit and joint enrichment without claiming to be an owner, without the title of ownership, a way of handling property that has hitherto gone unrealized in any economic and banking system. So the relation of this, I think, so we had in the beginning, we had this idea of knowledge or truth as a tree, where the roots are hidden, the trunk is mathematics or natural philosophy, physics, and the branches are all the disciplines. And here, it's like you can't generalize this tree, no? But the idea is you can capitalize. So the tree then produces harvest. It's growing out of the air. So speculation and profit and augmentation, all of these things. Because it accommodates, if you want, this impersonal cogito or the scientist within the tree nature of universal knowledge itself. Perhaps, no? I'm not sure. So I'm looking for constellations with regard to this book. I'm not sure if this is a good path, but it seems to make sense. Okay, let's go to the meta level a bit. So the time of this Gehege, der größeren Zeit. Maybe this helps. Do I have it? Yes, here. So there is always a kind of a quarrel that goes on, because of course time is of the essence, no? But how can this writing not become a historiography or a historian? And there is a constellation in the story, which that's why she is an adventure. So it's an epos, it's an epic, where Handke tries to complement what he calls die größere Zeit, das Gehege der größeren Zeit, to complement this idea that became very, very predominant all of the 20th century, actually, of the school of the Annales in history, which speak of the long duration, no? Die lange Dauer, so Brodel and so on, which basically said when we do history, we can no longer try to link events or attach them to people or to causes and to sequentiality. Rather, we need to study structural constellations that affect the infrastructures of life in history. So we work structurally in history. And then this structuralist point of view is called la longue durée, no? Die lange Zeit. And then with the la longue durée starts this whole discussions we have now about how does history organize the things? Is it in periods? Is it in epochs? Is it in years? So how do we actually count and recount chronological time? And la longue durée was a structuralist view to that, a bit like literature, which wants to do away with all the genres and everything becomes prose and novel. So la longue durée is structural, and what Handke, I think, poses, so he has one passage where he speaks explicitly of generica and complements it with what he calls homerica. No? And homerica from Homer, so this is that which happens in the Gehege der größeren Zeit, whereas das Generische happens in the long duration, in la longue durée. And it doesn't replace, it forms more, in my understanding now, it forms more like an axiality. And of the Homeric, yeah, maybe it's enough to just keep this. So there is a sense of an epos, of an adventure, and it manifests all throughout by qualifying many things as being epic. So she is the hero of this epos as the queen of finance, with a story that cannot be told, and she pays somebody to do it nevertheless. But then what we find is ways of dating what happens in this story, always in an epos. And then in an epos means there are things like epical hesitation. There are things like an epical problem. There are things like the epic which comes veiled, no? Or a breath which is epic, and der epische Atem, or rays of the sun, Sonnenstrahlen, which are episodic then. So it begins to differentiate these things. An epic year, no? Or an epically compressed eternity. Or he speaks of the image, a thoroughly epic problem in this. And the epic, yeah, so here, what we mean with an epoche, it's a kind of a cessation, means a stopping, no? An epoche, that's how we usually then make sense. In history, we speak of epochen. It's a cessation, translated as the suspension of judgment. Yeah? So in this way of storytelling, a story must be commensurate with an epoch. But the story of the Queen of Finance, I mean, it would be one epoch then. No? But the important thing is, and that's why it's a Queen of Finance, because finance is a way to encode the suspension of judgments. No? And yet there are stories, and yet there is plot, and yet there is datings and so on, but they unfold as the existence within Erzählung, as that which can only exist in Erzählung, so no originality in time. And because it's an Erzählung for which there is no originality in time, there can be a culture of the suspension of judgments. And this manifests, so we said a form of capital. Images, in the way that they operate here, are forms of capital. So learning to attend to the status of the images gives birth to forms of life. So this is how she is also characterized. So she is an adventurer in the quest of forms of life. But they are forms of life. I don't know if I have this episode, maybe. Yes, because this form of life now, it has to do with, but here it gets a bit, yeah, no, I don't have this clear in my head. So there's a discussion about why. So it's important that she is a woman. And yet narration, Erzählung, is without gender. That's what makes it work. So it's an existence which is genderless. That is possible through Erzählung and relative to Erzählung. But for this to be possible, the argumentation somehow is that the protagonist must be a woman.
That is a man writing the book.
Huh?
That is a man that is writing the book.
Yes. Yes, and he asks her, so, I mean, we can read, maybe it becomes clear when we read it, I don't know. So it's the epos of a woman, because she cannot, no, the thing is, she cannot, so like the hero of an epos usually makes adventures, no? And is a hero precisely because he survives these adventures. Nothing ever happens to her. So it's like the inverse of the constellation of a hero. That's why, yeah. So it's like if you want, the moon or the materia. capital as mass, I don't know, something like that. So nothing ever happens to her, but that's why she goes on it on her last travel. But on this last travel, it goes, that's the main framing of the plot. It's through the Sierra de Gredos, so through the Spanish desert. And in the Spanish desert, it's a kind of an encounter of the quality like Celan is writing about with her own images in a strange way. And the aim of this travel, but it's a mixture then between epic and tourism, no? Because she goes to hotels, she rents cars, she flies, but part of her Lebensform is then to walk backwards to the airport. There are all sorts of strange absurdities, and you see already from the passages, it's really hard to read this text already in German, but in English even more, because the sentences will never stop, and they're intermittent with other fragments, passages, and then it builds up and it goes on.
It looks to me like an instrument of writing, and she is a finance lady, and through her, he makes a kind of, but that's how I see it, what she said, a kind of meteoric architectonics, which is commensurable with finance, and creates time, which is commensurable with finance, and with her being a woman. And it creates a very different idea, a very different architectonics of time and writing, that then somehow for me she's an instrument, they're not a subject in any way. And for me that's very fascinating. I don't know if I'm on the right track.
Yeah, maybe instrument. Yeah. But it's also, so then what she says, so here she says, your task, so to the author again, no? Your task is to describe not cultural continuity, but the grander time. So describe the grander time, it's an impossibility, no? And it cannot happen. It is simply not permissible for the future to appear as an impossibility. It's impermissible for the future to appear as an impossibility, as is the case for the zone archivist. The Zonenarchivar, this is how he refers to la longue durée. No? The author, please accept my thanks for these lectures, but in my previous life as a writer, have I not done quite a bit or tried to develop a sense of this grander or also merely different time, and to make it strong enough to bear the weight of this long story, and that as this and this and another and yet another? The woman from the river port city, so that's her, it's also into a river port city. It's the rivers and ports between the rivers. So it's the intertitle, there must be something, but I haven't figured out. What do you think induced me to select you, of all people, to write this particular book? Idiot, the author. But why a man for this assignment? Wouldn't a woman be more suitable and also more appropriate to the spirit of the times as the teller of your adventures? Storytelling is storytelling is storytelling, whether a man or a woman tells the story. The minute you begin to tell a story, you are neither a man nor a woman anymore, but simply the storyteller. Or better still, you are the pure embodiment of storytelling. And by the way, the more sparing in your use of, so to speak, and as it were, be more sparing of this kind of ironic dislocations. The author, and should I assume that when someone's story is told, it does not matter whether the subject is a man or a woman? The Riverport woman? No. Our book must be about my story, a woman's story, if ever there was one. The author, in what respect, for instance? She, gazing along the line of her shoulder to the distant horizon on that side, to begin with, simply by virtue of telling a long story, no? Not une longue durée, a long story. So literary reason, not historical. A very long story, perhaps longer than all your previous ones. If a story is to be told about me and in general about a woman, it must be a long story. And something other than a woman's novel or a chronicle of life at court. If suited to our times, then something of this sort. And simultaneously, my and our story should run counter to our age. So it's a story which must be an epos, such that it can run counter to our age. as is appropriate for a book, because it's the story written in a book. So, and simultaneously, our story should circumvent our age. It should transcend it. It should subvert it. And by the way, the more sparing in your use of, be more sparing in your use of, for instance, because the for instance is always the colonization of the grander time, no? So this ironic dislocation is precisely, the taking over. It is obvious that every detail in our book suggests an example, no? The author, a story as long as Gone with the Wind. And about the woman in finance whose image as a woman is distorted or even destroyed by the image of money. The woman from the Riverport City, for all I care, equally long, or almost as long, or half as long. Even that would be something as Gone with the Wind, but in other respects with no resemblance. But then there is a way of reading Gone with the Wind very literal, no? Because that's exactly what she wants to happen to her, to be gone with the wind and kept in the age, in the epoch of the narration.
Yes.
Please.
Instead of thinking a woman, why not the feminine? Change. It's not a woman, but it's the feminine.
Yeah, but then the whole thing becomes allegorical. So like this, it's a story. If it's the feminine, then the person, the protagonist, is just an allegory for something else. And you go into the ironic duplication of the scenes of happening. But the sex is with the capital. That's why to encount, so die Erzählung und der Erzähler is without gender. It's the any sex, it's a capitalization of sex. So it also, I mean, there is one of the lines that goes through is her relation with her brother. And it's a relation where she always anticipated for him, so he could never grow up really. But also, I didn't select these passages, but it's very disturbing and complicated because it upsets the fraternity and sisterhood kind of modernism, of course. And it doesn't do away with the family scheme. So the ancestry don't go away, but it initiates a different way of relating. What is perhaps also interesting, he has a whole dialogue about there's a stonemason, no, because it's about the figuration here as well. There is a stonemason which keeps coming back, and there are very interesting ways of how he is introduced. So so the brother sister, the way that she was taking care of him was by foreseeing for him. No? But of course, as a capitalist, she can foresee anything or nothing. So he continuously feels left behind, and he turns a terrorist. So he's the violence element in all of this as it goes on. So the manifest violence element. But the stonemason, so it's an interiorization. So the stonemason makes the sculptures, no? So he takes examples and models and makes statues of it. But here, the way that the stonemason enters is by talking about that as a stonemason for a very long time, he had nothing to take out of himself. No, it was like an empty kind of medium. And then he began to think of himself as belonging to a people of Renaissance stonemasons, and he absorbed every one of their gestures and became this, and then had another metamorphosis into becoming yet another sculpture. So there is a whole kind of metamorphosis of what is the stance of being a sculptor. But I wasn't able to sort this out properly. But maybe we can, and then, yeah, try to bring it back to this cosmic self. Look at some of the meta themes. So she identifies, and that's a part of what this also, the contracted author needs to speak about, as somebody with a mission, but not a Cassandra. So ein Sendungsbewusstsein. It's a Sendungsbewusstsein which makes up her existence. But she's not talking of a disaster or a catastrophe. So this Sendungsbewusstsein manifests in being a pioneer for new life forms. They're life forms which are already lying in the air. No? So she doesn't invent them. She doesn't want to institute or constitute them. They are already lying in the air. So the attention to these life forms is one which is not zukunftsweisend. It doesn't show the past to the future, but it's in the present, gegenwartswesend, essentially attached to the present. And it's gegenwartsverstärkend, so it augments this present. Gegenwartsverstärkend, that's what the images also do. No? They ennoble the day for her. It's an augmenting of it. And what is a life form? So images are forms of capital, and life forms are forms that contain a feeling for life, ein Lebensgefühl. No, not more. So that there is an economy where there is no exchange value, but a lot of use value to such a setting. Yeah, so and it cannot be about her existence, because this existence can only be in the narration. We've already had this. And there is an interesting, there's a whole range of chapters which explicitly quotes or is in citational conversation with the existentialists. So with Le Mépris or with Sartre and the disgust. So with all these are Lebensgefühle, no? So it's not, because the problem with existentialism is that it boils down to, so you can't stand to be in touch with anything anymore if you're an existentialist. No? That's then why the absurd and so on is coming out of it. But in the existentialism starts by saying we need to attend only to our lives and to our life form. So existence, forget about being. This is Sartre. No? And what it produces is that nobody can be in touch with life forms and anymore, because it reduces to feelings which are not livable, no? Like le mépris or disgust and so on. So there are several chapters which engages with that. So then it's about feelings of life, but feelings of life that exist, yes, existence, but only in the encountered time, im erzählt werden. And through that, there is not this boiling down to this fundamental feelings. And the despair in his case is against, so the setup is that, you know, living in an epoch of distrust and so on, and of hatred. So then the plot, what actually happens in the book on a level is described, well, it's eine Liebesreise, it's a travel of love. And it's driven and it's telling of a kind of a desire which is beständig. Now, this is also a contradiction, because desire means you follow the course of the stars on the one hand, and on the other hand, in the secular sense, desire means you want what you lack. So you identify through lacking something and you want to complete yourself with desire. And he is talking of, just like when these travels are a quest for a treasure, but the treasure cannot ever get lost. No? Yeah. So it's a kind of a desire which is beständig. So it's beständig is not, it's not permanent in that sense. It's also not stable, but it's beständig. Yeah, I don't know how to properly translate it. So the desire which is always there, but in the mode that it is there, it is a longing. No? And this is the larger time is the taking care of these longings. And out of these longings, because these longings must somehow respond to something which lies in the air, life forms will come out that don't need to be instituted. And these life forms, they are of the quality of, he calls it ziellose Begeisterung. So a kind of an enthusiasm which is not aiming at anything in particular, but it's an enthusiasm. So this is the sensibility of this woman epos. No? And ziellose doesn't try to navigate the seas or to find a path or to explore the unknown. It's ziellos. Yeah, and in this, so this ziellose Begeisterung is the state of being dauerbeschäftigt, so always busy, but also busy with duration, but having time, always. Dauerbeschäftigt hat aber immer Zeit. So, and then these travels in a long duration, in this longue durée, in this structural sense of history, they turn into visits within the Gehege of the larger time, Gehege der großen Zeit. So the way that you can speak of these visits is only in puzzles, in Rätsel, in unbegreiflichen Bildern, in images which you can't grasp, but within a rhythm, und zwar immer gleich, so capital and standards. So the puzzle of which this author writes, when he writes her impossible story, is to write about her puzzle, and her puzzle is money. No? But then the way of speaking of money cannot describe it as a puzzle, because this would mean that it needs to be rationalized first. So it needs to be speaking through money. And the impossibility then turns into one where this enthusiasm, which needs to be without a goal, needs to be articulated. But if we would rationally articulate it, we would measure it in terms of success. And whenever we measure it in terms of success, then Erzählen is being reduced to calculation. Yeah. So the Erzählen works with calculation. Yeah, but cannot be reduced to its effects. That's also why it's an epic story. So it's about enthusiasm and interiorization, no? Embodiment. But what is being embodied is the reduction to calculation. But what cannot be embodied, but can be ordered. So das Ordnen der Begeisterung, the enthusiasm, there can be, so through the Lebensform, there starts to be an order to the enthusiasm. And this cannot be interiorized, because it would mean it becomes a culture, no? It becomes regional. So it cannot be interiorized, but what it does is, es schafft Dankbarkeit. It creates a kind of a great gratefulness. Or grace, perhaps, I don't know. And then, so this, like Celan, to translate this is really, so you need to copy, you need to craft it out of the copiousness, which probably means to totally rewrite, I'm not sure, no? But it cannot go directly. He has, his whole words are, so then the thing takes, so there's a story of the Neubegeisterte und der Schlossherr, no? Because it's about the images ennobling the day. And it's really, there are many scales which go throughout, and you can start to a bit like when you parse it, no? To read it with this scale and to read it with that scale, and it connects in 1,000 ways. Also the newly euphoric and the master of the castle. And then der springsollende Schrankknecht. No? So the springsollend, so he's supposed to jump, but he's a servant of the closet, supposed to jump. So it's all these kinds of constructions. But then the place where a large part of the story in this Sierra de Gredos happens is in the Tafelland Einöde. So it's a table, it's a land, it's a desert. And in it, there are, so one scale would be to read it for its architectonic forms. No? There are four, so entry spaces, Anlagen, so they're not Gehege and parks. So, and to differentiate that. Yeah, and the way that he refers to her is ein Bündel ungerichteter Begeisterung. No? And this is what I find beautiful or interesting now when we go back to Popper in the beginning. No? When Popper begins to say, no, we need to rehabilitate the moon. No? Even if the moon doesn't have an original brilliance, there is an active attention to the rays of the son of her brother. So the story, it's their brothers, Céline and don't remember the son, Helios. No? So Céline is looking, so what Popper says is the critical rationalism lives from appreciating the moon in how the moon is capable to focus on and to follow and to put into her attention the rays of the sun. And this, so I don't think it's about no kind of a feminist revolution or anything. It's not. It's much more a story which starts to live in this critical rationalism space, where the moon is, yeah, ein Bündel ungerichtete Begeisterung.
I was thinking before, should we then ask Popper what he would think about why it shows the moon? Because the moon.
What would you ask Popper?
Because Popper is struggling with this, like why is in German the moon masculine and feminine, and I was just. Yeah, maybe you would have interesting answers to this. Also, I was just thinking about ancient mythology, where they always have this motive of petrification, and basically, and it's mostly always female body, which then kind of dissolves in some sort of cosmic thing. If I think of Diane. The man stays somehow static, stays in its body, or if it's about roles with dissolve into a cosmic being.
Yeah, but it's so through this mode of, so if Erzählen itself is without genders, it's another take on the metamorphosis plot, no? And on this figuration, and also on myth, because in myth everything depends upon the relation of the sexes. So there is a quantitative, a data or a coding, a calculative relation to myth then. So and this is in a way interesting, because in myth what you have is transformation, so it's algebra and the cipher. And now the cipher kind of begins to manifest through money and through finance and through speculation, which creates the life conditions here. And with Popper, actually, when you are saying, I think that's very interesting, because he was a moon. Huh? So when you think of Popper and Wittgenstein is a sun, Popper is a moon, but he doesn't want to be a moon, not really. No? But then perhaps he does in the end, and there is a softness then to that. Yeah. Yeah, and what is important then is always to, that's the one, so in this travel, you are traveling when you do one thing, but as a whole. But of course you can't say what one thing is, no? So, but you have to do it as a whole. This is the concentration. And then he speaks of a time particular to the book. maybe there are some nice, yeah, he speaks of a Wunschkraft, so a force of wishing. Yeah, and again, he speaks of the images as meteors. No, meteors between heaven and earth. And he connects, this I liked very much. He connects Leuchtkraft und Nachhaltigkeit. So sustainability and Leuchtkraft is brilliance, but it's the moderation of brilliance, no? Or the measurement of brilliance, or of shining or radiance or whatever.
Luminance.
Yeah, not firm in the physical measures, but something like that. Yeah, I think I have snippets, but these are the main lines. And then the idea is to, so if we affirm this finance as a kind of a way of telling existence, which takes responsibility for how existence is told. So that's the epic aspect of it, or it's also the ethical aspect of it. So yeah, I guess the question, or there is not really a culmination point. No, it's more a constellation laid out. But where I think this constellation is really interesting is to think about this relation between free will and the rational, or rationalization through existence that can only live in Erzählung. And then this Erzählung needs to become, it needs to involve cosmos again. It cannot be just politics and biographies and history and epistemology. It needs to involve cosmos again, as a kind of a being that relates to the breath, no? Like Elias was talking about. So how to take breath into account. So the tree, okay, we think of it as a tree, but the tree grows not only from the soil, like with Heidegger, it also grows out of the air, this loftiness. That's it.
Yeah, I have many things wrote down. Maybe I come here. So, yes, so this one is somehow. Can you hear me from the Zoom sphere? Well, or
yes,
here. And so at the beginning of your talk, you had a bit this kind of, what I had the feeling was a kind of an architectonic disposition. So you have this idea of the event, and then the advent, so something that goes with the Gegen or the Gegenwärtig, and then the Erzählen, no? And because there was really, something similar in relationship to the case. So the case in relationship to event and accident. So the accident would be something that is Gegenwärtig. And then in distinction to the Eraugen, so the Ereignis, which is the event in German. And then if we could consider these three things as some kind of, in terms of architectonic disposition, so where the case, or this, or this Erzählung perhaps comes up. So on one hand, the foreign elements, or the event or the existence as well, so something that comes from the outside. Then the oppositional one, so the Gegen, and then the percolating one, so the Erzählung or the Ereignis. Something like this. In this sense, for me, this will be some kind of an architectonic of chance or of the case. And then, yeah, the case in this sense for me would perhaps be something very close to what I was thinking as an image. So as something that in the words of Kocha, as a kind of objective unconscious. So similar in this sense, as I understand it, to the role of the state reserve you were describing. So something that can welcome materially, bodily, shadowly. So in that sense, with Parmenides, what you describe as the cosmic consciousness. So the objective unconscious is the place where the cosmic consciousness can be there, because the objective unconscious is both impersonal and intransitive. So it's kind of like the case, it's a fall. It's not something which is falling, and it's not a fall it's not a fall with an object, not with a subject, but it's kind of orphan in that sense. So it can create this kind of clearing in the roots of shape. And
interesting.
yeah. And yeah, so you were saying yourself that kind of AI, so this in sense is somehow, I understand it as impersonal, and then the case would be both impersonal and intransitive. And yeah, and then yeah, then skipping a bit and then going to, you were speaking of the roads of the impossible, and this reminded me of, there's this passage on in the Chari's book on the beginning, on the Inizio, which speaks of Techne, as narrated in the Politikon and the Protagoras of Plato, speaking about their constitutive aporeticity, so a kind of impossibility in the sense of aporeticity, so the lack of a kind of poros of access, and is deeply related to something that he calls, I think, after Plato, an armostia, which I don't know if it can relate to what you were saying before the desperation, but because an armostia is a kind of state of, it's not even a state, it's a kind of, so is the time of Zeus, which is set by the order of Kronos, and it's a time in which peace is not there anymore. So the peace is a state before which has been lost. So you reach the helm of the cosmos, and the demiurge just left the cosmos alone, and the cosmos starts to proceed toward a kind of disorder, if you like, to put it in a very banal terms. And the interesting thing that I thought it related to what you were saying is that first techne, or art, as you were saying, is the only order able to survive in this age. And it survives as an imitation and a memory of that peace that preceded it. And by remembering its fulfillment, the fulfillment of this peace, so it's a kind of remembering of something before, but then it's a remembering of fulfillment, it participates in it. And it has also to do with distance. So it's kind of, it's what can engender and preserve distance at the same time. And then poetry is, in this sense, key as a kind of techne in that, because it's a form of offering or of sacrifice in this kind of order of an armostia or of techne, and it's what in this sense, in the sacrifice, the Chinese speaks of what is related to a tiffany, so a disposition of the altar, so related also to existence as we're describing it, so something which is so in a position, and then in which the very offering is the very offering of the song of the word. So it's about the offering. The sacrifice what is offered is the word. So it's a chant or the words of poetry, and this is the most precious offering because it's the weapon by which man alone survives. And it established the unattainability of that order. It meditates on its remoteness, which gradually expands. So this is also a kind of distance. When the place of sacrifice, and of chanting, so in the sense of poetry, is established, the dominant anamortia is not eliminated at all. Only space is made available. A short space is freed in the very middle of the forest where meditation can take place, so light. And then here light is related to a locus, that opens up in the forest. But is evidently a light embraced by the darkness and conceivable only in relation to the latter. So in that sense, also Parmenidean, as you were describing it. And the most powerful are modzei, so the most powerful kind of trying to reach this harmony will always appear infinitely weaker than the necessity of an honesty. So it's also surrounded by this kind of desperation. Yeah, I don't know if this makes sense.
I think we should talk about that. Yes, so it's interesting, but you said so to welcome the cosmic consciousness, not to accommodate.
Yeah.
My point is that the cosmic consciousness, so in a way, needs to be lived. So it's interesting. So to accommodate it, we have an order of authority which is superior to this evolvement of the cosmic consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
So it wants to be friendly, it wants to accommodate it, but it is detached from it, eternal or whatever, and superior for it. And my fascination with this text would be not specifically like that. But there is the notion of the case as an anti-eternal case, I think can be addressed from this line as well, because all that the story writes about, like every story, is about examples, but examples that precisely don't represent the authority of the past, but through remembering the past, create a model to mimic or to live towards in the present, in a kind of a ziellose, goalless enthusiasm.
Mm-hmm.
So all the elements with the sacrifice, with the offer, with the order, it's all there, but it's not so much about accommodating this as the consciousness of another, but as identifying with the cosmic consciousness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some sort of compenetration in a way. So yeah, which has to do also with with the fact that the case is always.
It needs to be figured out.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's impersonal, objective, non-narrative. So it's the case which creates this enables the forgetting. The case which enables the forgetting in a categorical way. But for that, there needs to be a general treatise on sculpture. And the being a general treatise on sculpture is no longer sculpture, and it's no longer an art. So it's no longer sculpture or poetry or art. This becomes, it's in this in-between, no? So then if you have the cosmos between existence and being as that of the general order, it is a general order which is being engendered through how we develop, acquire, build out, whatever it would be, this cosmic self, this cosmic consciousness in impersonal voices. And it must be a cosmic consciousness which can accommodate an innumerable amount of impersonal voices which all participate in it. But if you would think of it in terms of how can we accommodate it, we are the master of the gig, the größeren Zeit, which means the größere Zeit would be made small.
Yeah, perhaps in that sense was more the accommodation was a more kind of post-take or a class
opening up.
Yeah, opening up. Yeah, that was the more the point. Yeah.
I think there's a moment of where natural communication plays a role a lot. I think moment of desperation is the level 8, and this is what Henke bypasses by making bridges through this lady. Yeah, to create new time, new tenses, new images, new constellation through the lady who is not just a lady, who is a lady, and then brings back to the level 8 and rewrites his text through this new architectonics that she gave. And there's no desperation anymore. Then he
yes, I feel so as well. No? Even though it sounds very desperate and brave and
yes, but it's light. So in a strange way, it's light. But it's like when I try to show or to find it, it's gone. But it's there. It's not a desperate book. And the loss of images is not a mourning of a time which is irremediably gone. It's not that. And the images are also not gone. They're actually present through this loss. Yeah. But what you were saying, Ricardo, is this time in that's nice, no? To have a time when, I don't remember what the word was, it's aporicity. So, so to think it's a way of thinking the aporia. So the aporia means there's no way out. So there's no way out. But we can talk of it. we can speak of it. So that would be the story here. Yeah.
Yeah, and for me, so this time, which is also the one of described as an armostia, is precisely the time in which, or the age, or whatever you want to call it, in which the condition in which natural communication can happen, because it's where you can have obstacles. So,
and then the obstacle, the way of the obstacle is not through trying to figure out the
properties, but through giving to it. No, so the obstacle means, okay, here is something bad dawning. It's an obstacle, so I pay tribute. I want the protection of this thing, so I pay to it because I have infinitely much as a capital with these images. No, so rather than negotiating the properties and the fair balance of it in terms of a general economical order, it's paying tribute to it. But yeah, is this then the same as a fetishism? I'm not sure. Or where does it become that? Or what are then these boundaries? Or is it that, yeah, I don't know.
Regarding the comment, just etymologically also. An armostia is coming from N, which is Latin in, and armostia is again the same root like harmony, like arithmos, like archi. So it is a type of evolution of harmonics within the state, thought as a kind of having again a body and a soul. So it does not doesn't have to do with placing it within historical time.
Because that would be
the no-go. So then we lose everything if we place it in historical time.
Yeah. Now I just want to fit it back in the beginning of the talk, because Heidegger, especially with Popper, I think all it's about ontology. I think that the fact that Heidegger was looking for grounding the roots on the soil, this is exactly what ontology is about.
Ontology decoupled from metaphysics. Huh?
Yes, that's why I insisted. I mean, the critical step, I mean, the critical bridge is to go from ontology to axiology. Yeah. And because if you want to do ontology, you need a ground where everything will be solidified. You are able to locate the roots. So this creates the territoriality, the belongingness. It is the attachment to the soil. And of course, we know that this, how it evolved in ideologies at the time. It's exactly this kind of materialization of this ontological perspective. From the other side, if somehow you try to bypass ontology, you see ontology exactly as the obstacle, then you do not want grounding on the earth. It is all the elements, you know, you need the whole quadrillion, actually not only the air. I think the tree needs the water, needs fire, needs the air and the earth. So it's a whole quadrillion through which a complete circulation can be performed.
You're right. My polarization was anti-Heidegger.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
But I think then with the relation to historical time, perhaps this is where somehow the epos comes, no? So because I always see the epos as this kind of barrier between myth and literature, or history as a form of literature, or something like this. So as yeah, as this kind of agreeing with me, but, making fun of me.
That was epic.
So yeah, and that sense, I wonder perhaps if it has to do with this kind of, you were saying paying tribute, because it's a kind of paying and also of Bildverlust, if you want, spending of things, so that percolate from the myth into this other duet, or yeah. So
Yes, but it's
so if we think through the epos, if you think history through the epos, then history becomes climatic. It's in the air, it's in the fire, it's in the water. History itself becomes objective.
yeah.
And then that's where there can be, so then attending to nature, the natural as natural, involves the epic gesture, because it can work with not these things like episches Zögern, epic hesitation. History, there is no hesitation, the space of history. But if history is dissolves itself, I don't know, maybe then it has to do with these processes that they were talking about with the thinking change, where you have rarefaction and condensation. So, but then this would be this would actually be what the storytelling needs to dissolve. So not to accumulate.
But this resonates, I think, with because I was looking up with desire, because it never made sense for me that it has to do with stars, because a star is another etymology. But the Sidus is actually not really a star, but a constellation. So it's a figure in that sense, it's a kind of image, but and it has to do with the origin of the Greek word is actually with the molten iron. So it has to do with this kind of process of melting and consolidating, and so.
It's this gravitational mass.
Yeah.
it's a graphene. No, it's
Well, it's a notion of a mass which can be molded, and this is well, a sculpture starts from.
Nice, even better. Then with the stars, the constellation of the stars, that's
Gravitational mass that can be molded. Yeah.
And it's interesting that iron, because in I don't know if, yeah, maybe this is a jump, but you were also speaking of the moon, and the iron there's a passage in Vera where the iron is what can be prepared so it can light up, and so it's a kind of material that is thought as something that can kind of capture light, but in this way, which is like in an active way, a bit like the moon does. So it's in this sense an aggregatum, or I think what you would describe as an alloy, a material alloy. So it has to do with this kind of photosynthesis, this participation to light.
Another more etymological addition to this, I tried to actually back it up with research. Couldn't now find anything, but I remember my Latin teacher telling me that so cosmos is deeply rooted in jewelry, and you know, you would talk about cosmatum decke, for example, and you know, I think this is very nice because jewelry again itself has a certain spectrality, and yeah.
Yeah, this was nice in Elias' system with the cosmos and then as a decorative
Being, no? It's yeah. The necklaces, the constellations. Yeah.
I have a question regarding the.
But that's because that's probably the reason why it needs to be a woman with this decoration. Because if you think that what the moon does is follow the course of the rays of Helios, then this is the complementary movement which we lack today when we try to sit on the light beams and travel through time. No? So that's what particle physics basically does now. So then the counterpole would be this. Yes.
The moon is on the eclipse. I mean, when the light from the sun is refracted, So it's going around the moon, and you have the sun on the Earth. So it's the optical diffraction which characterizes the moon.
The diffraction as it manifests in the plane of the ecliptic.
Yeah, yes, on the plane of the ecliptic, but it has to do with the eclipses. What's called eclipses is, I don't know in English.
Eclipse. So
Eclipse, eclipse, yes. Exactly, yes. It's eclipse.
Ah, Mondfinsternis, Sonnenfinsternis. Yeah. Aha. But how do you mean this is what qualifies the moon? What does it mean?
But you can see the moon, if you do not think of the moon as an object, the moon is the obstacle through which the diffraction of the light spectrum from the sun can be seen on Earth. And then you have this spectrality, this coloring, this red perigram, you know, the whole sun.
Moon is the obstacle through which the light spectrum can be seen on Earth.
It's diffraction, because the moon is the obstacle for the light from the sun. So the light is diffraction means it starts to circulate around. And that's why we see on Earth, you know, this circular figure having this red circumference.
May I have a question? Or?
Yes, please. One.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah. What is the limits of applying what we understood, let's say, from a phenomena like refraction or light? What is the limit that we use this knowledge on human? So let's say now within our discussions, Elias said something about a behavior of, let's say, the light and how it's refract. How we consciously and unconsciously relate this description with, let's say, a question of an obstacle like what Nicola said about this art and how we look at it. And is it why we sometimes look at this thing as a as something strange or not? Because I still feel that we correlate our knowledge of humans to what is seen in nature. So when you say natural human, do you mean materialistic natural human, or there is another thing is hidden?
But maybe of the lights and so on, Elias can say something. For me, the point would be to think of the human as we think of nature. So not there is a nature to human and then there are deviations. Just like in physics, it's not like there is a deviated physics and an original one, but physics is the study of what we can describe about nature as nature in a scientific way, and to relate to the human in the same way. And then the problem or the ethical question is always then, what is this knowledge used for? No, if we use it to legitimate the planning, so a planning would be the opposite of traveling in the Gehege der großen Zeit. So the beauty with this capitalist story is that it's an accumulation, it's a richness in knowledge, and that means in power. But this richness is any direction is taken out of it. No?
And how to evaluate this richness, that it's richness. Now you start to talk about a little bit some values. How to evaluate it?
That would be something, no, that's why I started with this relation of the free will and rationality. No? So what you are asking is basically, how do we give boundaries to the free will? My attitude would be we shouldn't. no? Because the free will produces boundaries inevitably, it can never be infinite. If it pushes rationality, and if rationality manifests in irrationalities that again need to be bridged because they start to produce obstacles to each other and so on. So to live, so to commit into to a rationalism which which is not put to use in the sense of a legitimation, but which is enhancing the free will. And then how to speak of values, that maybe you can say something about the axiology more in this direction, Elias. So the
basic idea is that we distinguish between principles and values.
Yeah.
And the idea is that principles can be ordered. So you can say that morally this is better than something else. Whereas in the case of values, in the sense of what's called the ethos, the values cannot be ordered. So they form different constellations. And a nice metaphor for them is to think of them as giving rise to the consonances in the sense of a harmonic scale. And the different scalings of the harmonic scale is what gives rise to different types of ethical characters. Without bounds, as you said, strict bounds on the free will.
Okay, but now I understand because these things buzzing a lot in my mind, and maybe my next talk is somehow within all of what we are discussed in the last 10 years as a group. So this is maybe tomorrow, but for now you talk about values. The first step you said about the mathematical values, but not the human values. Do you see the human values is something in similar to the mathematical values?
For you.
Yeah, I think arithmetic is ethic. Yes, I think it's a form of ethos.
Okay, so
yeah, ethical, yes.
So we can say that I try to abstract something. Now you shifted from that. Yes, it's mathematically. Now you are talking about arithmetically. So how can we describe some phenomena like a woman sacrifice her life to her kids? How to find the value for this?
Don't expect me to answer in 1 minute. That's an answer. Yes. So we can talk about this, but not now.
Yeah, because I think that we are almost revolving around looking for in each of these phenomena what is the nearest reference to revolve around. Sometimes this human or nature, or they are both the same, and sometimes I think that we do not deal with that. We are somehow limited to reach some boundaries. So why? So yeah, that's it. We are just limited, and we try to navigate until to see what limits. But to judge, because I feel that we are deviating unconsciously or consciously. I don't know. It depends on each one of us to judge. With judging, then you have to have a clear reference. And with humanities, for me, usually all what we are discussing about geometry, about physics, it's I'm open. But when we start to talk human, and this is one of the things that is puzzling for me a lot, and I will talk about it maybe tomorrow, about natural. The word natural is, for me, I understand it in a different way. The same when you say human or humanity. Usually I think, I know what is human, maybe from my perspective. And then I found that Sometimes we talk about the humanity only that the human is a good thing, and we forgot that no, the human is good and bad. And if you remove the bad, so this is not a human. You want angels. So you have to accept it like this.
A short comment, because I don't want to take the time. But when you distinguish between good and bad, this is a moral distinction. It is based on moral principles. It's the fact that you can order that the good is better than the bad, because this is a moral scale. I'm not talking about this type of thing. That's why I'm talking about ethos, ethical values. You cannot order them. So you have truth, you have beauty, you have justice, you have this type of things. You cannot say truth is better than beauty.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Perfect. But yeah, but this maybe this by that I start to understand something. So now, when you at the Elias, not only at the Elias as a mathematician or a physicist, there is another dimension related that some boundaries of these terminologies. So you pass these terminologies through our discussion, then unconsciously maybe I know some spectrum and not, or Vera knows something else. Then I find the discussion deviated a little bit. Then we put the human. Then the human is treated like everything. Just a comment. I wanted to navigate a little bit, and then maybe tomorrow I can, maybe give a little bit more details from my point of view.
Part of what I found interesting and relevant for this with Pauselan was precisely that he introduces this way of attending to the human in a kind of a poetic cosmic construction in which the human always appears in the inclination angle of the meridian, which is also its own creatureliness. That's how he puts it. Im Neigungswinkel seine Kreatürlichkeit is the way that Celan puts it. So the human, or even the nature of the human, is not something that we can define or make or embody. So there is a sense of if we say the human is to be looked at as natural as well, which transcends our responsibility and our craftsmanship. So it is always already limited because of that. So that was actually, I'm not sure where you want to bring it, but to speak of the nature of the human is a very dangerous thing, no? And there has been it has been done a lot in the 20th century, and all the positions I tried to bring into a constellations were actually made to caution and to point to a different path. So this is why there is this sense of desperation as either a total climate or as a kind of a background before which Handke's constellation tries to set itself apart. So it's not at all a glorious journey. Yeah? It's not at all a kind of a,
okay, so the nature of human is dangerous, as you said, but I think that we sometimes we have to think about him or us, as we can see. We have to touch these kind of points. So we have just to be stable when we look at it, because let's say if I'm an architect, at the end I am developing I'm not developing something for a human, not for me even as a one. So how to just deal with this? Maybe
my
tomorrow.
Point would be we cannot be stable about this. That's an ethical stance. Nobody can claim to be stable with regard to this.
Yes. Also, when I mean stable, I don't mean stable all the time, kind of an absolute balances. And this is not what I am tackling. It's like that there is, it's like to avoid catastrophic positions.
Good. We hear about that in your talk, no?
Okay. Because sometimes, because it's like that we push all of these thoughts into a kind of a progress for humanity. Then there is some critical points for me is like that we are going up. This is what I imagine, going up to the mountain. Let's go up. Then it's in the volcano, not a mountain.
Good. We'll pick up tomorrow. It's your presentation.
Yeah. Okay, sorry.
Now we need to make a lunch break. I think we still have 1 hour. Yes. There are more questions. Yes. Okay.
It's das Erzählung Word origin, or does it not require an origin?
It doesn't. It dissociates it or encapsulates it into capital.
Okay.
So it's like it's this.
Can be half of it or double of it, but it remains bracketed. That's what is being ciphered in the capital. And then you can rationalize and proportion it, but you don't have an absolute and you don't have a normative theory.
You know what I was thinking that was because like with the count, not the clock in the sense of counting time, but with to count, even if it doesn't need to be an absolute reference, don't you need like at least saying, okay, now I start counting.
But that's the storytelling. So the storytelling, I mean, you cannot tell a story where everything happens at once. You will always have to turn the pages. No? So there is a chronology relative. That's why he says one story needs to be coextensive to an epoch. And an epoch is a cut, a beginning. So the story is this, but then the story that you keep telling is that of an adventure, of an ethos. So the ethos and the epoch go together, and what you get is periodic temperings. And the periodic temperings are the spherical ones where you have accents, the grave and the circumflex and so on. So you qualify how the treatise of the words, which has been mobilized, constellates itself into words that articulate in a way always the same thing. But on an adventure where you search for a treasure which cannot even be lost. I mean, how can there be a treasure if it cannot be lost? But that's the thing where you need to be enthusiastic but unoriented. So not the telos.
My mother is also a short one. And it's on the passage from the Median when it shows, it says, I know we can read it different ways with a variety of accent. Yeah, cute, and then it comes to the circumflex.
Yeah.
Marking length of the eternity.
Yeah.
And I was wondering regarding to this, because I was just looking at the etymology of circumflex, that leads to the idea of prosody.
Yes.
And then in that sense, like...
That's why art is a iambic and it has the metric feet. It lives in poetry, but poetry doesn't represent it and it doesn't philosophize.
And then it becomes prosody. Prosody meaning like a voice with, correct me if I'm wrong, prosodia, it means a voice with an around. And in that sense, the circle, like bend it in an arc. And then there is a kind of rhythmicality in that.
Yes, it's a rhythmicality, a matrix of a rhythmicality. And that's what, the poetic, I don't know in detail precisely, but that is a very interesting place to look at. And it should relate to the transliteration as well. So the Umschrift. And to the kind of adaptation that an Umschrift, that a transliteration allows, an accommodation, an adaptation, an acculturation even, which doesn't touch the essence of the words, or at least not intentionally touch the essence of the words, but lets them kind of be have an adaptive way to it. Yeah.
Just one last thing, because then if we think the circumflex and then the prosodia in that sense, if it's circum, then it is about an arch and a chord.
Of course, yes, I agree. And that's why then this is the tempering in eternity. Then you have, but it goes together with the historical one and the present one as well. And they are like consonances. They're not one after the other, or one or the other. They're always all of them.
Yeah,
that's why you figure it out of the air. Also not you.
Yeah, in that sense, without a beginning and an end, and then that's
without an origin.
That's probably why it says it's marked less. That's interesting. I mean, it's for powerful the idea of the circumflex.
Good. Let's meet at 2.